Hello, and welcome to Cotswold Cozy Mysteries. I'm Clara Whitfield. In Carsley, even a jumble sale can become dangerous when people begin recognising the things others meant to forget. Among the unwanted china, old coats and tarnished jewellery, several villagers have donated more than household clutter. They have also brought old grudges, private embarrassments, and one secret that refuses to remain discarded. Agatha Raisin, meanwhile, has arrived determined to prove that she possesses impeccable country taste. The village is ready to judge for itself. So settle somewhere comfortable as we begin the brooch in the donation box. Have you ever given something away and later wished no one had examined it too closely? Chapter 1. Things People Give Away. Agatha Raisin entered Carsley Parish Hall carrying a porcelain shepherdess and an expression of modest generosity. The shepherdess wore a pink dress, held a gilded crook, and had eyelashes almost as impressive as Agatha's own. Agatha had bought it 3 years earlier in Morton-in-Marsh, but had recently decided that it might be antique. "I thought it might raise something for the heating fund," she told Mrs. Bloxby. "I hardly notice it at home." This was untrue. She had spent half the previous evening moving it between shelves to discover where it looked most valuable. "How generous," said Miriam Cotterill, chief organiser of the second chance sale. She wore a roll of orange price labels around one wrist. "The better items are going on Diana's table." Agatha's satisfaction faded. Diana Vellum stood beneath a sign marked "Collectibles," arranging silver frames and china dogs on a white cloth. Her cream wool dress suggested she had no intention of carrying anything heavier than a teacup. She glanced at Agatha's shepherdess. "How cheerful." "I believe it may be 19th century," said Agatha. "Do you?" Diana's voice was quiet and refined. Agatha recognised it as the tone used by women who insulted others without disturbing their lipstick. Around them, the hall was filling with unwanted possessions. Coats sagged from a portable rail. Towers of paperbacks leaned across a trestle table. Reverend Bloxby examined a brass object with concern. "Garden equipment?" he suggested. "It's a trivet," said Miriam. At the far end, Percy Lobb opened boxes with a pocket-knife. Percy dealt in house clearances and had the dusty cheerfulness of a man accustomed to exploring dead people's cupboards. He lifted a silver photograph frame, rubbed his thumb along one corner, and dropped it into a box marked Miscellaneous Metal. Then the doors opened. Althea Glyde entered wearing a dark green coat and a silk scarf. Conversation did not stop, but it became more careful. Althea had once written society columns in London and now gave lectures about antiques and taste. She had volunteered to value the best donations. She kissed the air beside Diana's cheek, greeted the Bloxbys warmly, and touched Miriam's arm. Miriam stiffened. Then Althea noticed Agatha. "Mrs. Raisin! How splendid!" Agatha distrusted splendid. "I've brought something for valuation." Althea looked at the shepherdess. "Have you indeed? She may be rather good. Then we must examine her later." Her tone suggested the shepherdess had been detained for questioning. Agatha turned away and crouched beside a jewellery box, hoping to appear useful. It contained plastic beads, unmatched earrings, and velvet cases with nothing inside. Near the bottom lay an oval marcasite brooch. Its stones were dull, its safety chain was missing, and the metal beside the clasp showed an old repair. When Agatha lifted it, the broken fastening caught the cardboard lining. "Careful," said Miriam sharply. She crossed the hall and reached towards it, then stopped. "It's only a brooch," said Agatha. "Some of those pieces are damaged." Althea appeared beside them. "What have you found?" Agatha held out the brooch. For an instant, Althea's pleasant expression vanished. She studied the repaired clasp, then looked at Miriam. Agatha saw recognition pass between them. Althea took the brooch. Marcasite. Pretty little nonsense. She dropped it back into the box. The dismissal was too quick. "Worth anything?" Percy asked from behind Agatha. "Not everything interesting is valuable," said Althea. Across the hall, Diana had stopped arranging her display. One hand rested flat upon the white cloth. Miriam picked up the brooch and wrapped it in newspaper. She folded the corners into neat triangles with practised movements. "This one isn't ready for the table." "Why not?" asked Agatha. "The clasp is dangerous." "A threat to public safety," said Agatha. Miriam did not smile. She placed the wrapped brooch beneath a stack of labels and carried it away. Althea watched her go. Then she turned to Agatha's shepherdess. "I hope you'll stay for the valuation evening, Mrs. Raisin. Objects can reveal surprising things about their owners. My objects reveal excellent taste. I'm sure they reveal something." Althea moved on. Mrs. Blocksby approached with 2 cups of tea. "Is there anything stronger?" Agatha asked. "Not officially." Agatha accepted a cup and watched the room. Miriam was speaking quietly to Althea. Diana pretended not to observe them. Percy had returned to the silver frame. Felix Brandt, the young volunteer managing the online listings, was photographing the jewellery box. The broken brooch had vanished beneath Miriam's papers, yet everyone seemed aware of where it had been. People claimed they gave things away because they no longer needed them. Agatha suspected that some objects were discarded because keeping them had become unbearable. Others were given away in the hope that no one would ever ask where they had come from. Chapter 2. The Valuer Smiles. By 7 o'clock, the parish hall smelled of wet coats, instant coffee and furniture polish. The valuation evening had attracted nearly everyone in Carsley who owned an object inherited from a relative and believed it had been criminally underestimated by the family. A queue stretched from Althea's table to the bookstall. Villagers clutched lamps, medals, clocks, and china animals with expressions usually reserved for medical test results. Agatha stood near Diana's display, pretending not to care when her shepherdess would be examined. Sir Charles Fraith appeared beside her in a tweed jacket. "Which treasure is yours?" Agatha pointed. "The shepherdess." Charles studied it. "Sweet. Do not say cheerful." "I wouldn't dream of it." At the valuation table, Althea handled each object with elegant confidence. She told Mrs. Cribbage that her painted vase was worth more emotionally than commercially. She informed Mr. Pritchard that his grandfather's military watch had been made 20 years after the war he claimed to have worn it in. She praised one chipped bowl so warmly that its owner nearly cried. The villagers enjoyed each humiliation, provided it belonged to someone else. Felix photographed the better objects for the online list. Percy Lobb hovered nearby, offering opinions only when he thought Althea would agree with him. Miriam carried cups of coffee from the kitchen and kept glancing towards the stack of labels beneath which she had hidden the brooch. Diana noticed Agatha watching. "You do seem fascinated by the jewellery." "I'm fascinated by people who pretend not to be." Diana lowered her voice. "Some objects carry unfortunate associations." The quieter Diana spoke, the more Agatha suspected she was lying. "What sort of associations?" "Family ones." Before Agatha could press her, Reverend Blocksby called her name. "Mrs. Raisin, I believe you are next." The room seemed to become interested at once. Agatha carried the shepherdess to Althea's table and placed it carefully beneath the lamp. "I don't expect it to be terribly valuable," she said. Charles coughed. Agatha ignored him. Althea turned the ornament over and examined the base. "Where did you acquire her?" "A specialist shop." "In Morton-in-Marsh?" Agatha hesitated. "Yes." 3 years ago?" A few people in the queue smiled. Althea tapped the printed mark beneath the base. She is a recent reproduction in a broadly Victorian style. How recent? Possibly newer than Felix. Felix looked embarrassed to have become a dating system. A ripple of laughter travelled through the hall. Agatha felt her face burn. The dealer told me it came from an estate. Everything comes from an estate eventually, said Althea. Charles placed a sympathetic hand on Agatha's shoulder. She removed it. Still, Althea continued, she is decorative. £20, perhaps, if someone likes pink. I don't particularly like pink, said Agatha. Then donating her was very wise. The laughter was louder this time. Agatha carried the shepherdess back to the display and resisted the urge to drop it into the nearest rubbish bin. Mrs. Blocksby met her with a cup of coffee. That was unkind. It was accurate, said Agatha. The two are not always required to arrive together. Agatha drank the coffee. It was dreadful, which suited her mood. Althea continued through the queue until Felix brought forward a tray of jewellery. Miriam immediately stepped closer. I haven't finished sorting that. My dear, disorder is often where the interesting things hide, said Althea. She lifted a string of pearls, dismissed them as imitation, and examined a small gold ring. Then she looked towards the stack of labels. One item appears to be missing. Miriam's hand tightened around the coffee pot. What item? Asked Diana. Althea smiled. Nothing valuable. At least, not in the usual sense. The hall quietened. Agatha watched Diana's face lose colour. Percy began buttoning his coat. Althea looked around the room with the pleased expression of a performer who had felt the audience lean forward. There is something among these donations with a family history people might prefer to mislay. Miriam dropped a roll of labels. They scattered across the floor. Reverend Blocksby bent to help her, but she waved him away. Just clumsy, she said. Althea's gaze remained on her. Percy moved towards the door. Early start tomorrow, he announced. You said your first clearance wasn't until noon, Felix replied. Percy rubbed his thumb across the doorframe. Plans change. Diana stepped closer to Althea. This is a charity sale, not one of your columns. Althea's smile sharpened. My columns were often charitable. I allowed people to discover what others already knew. That is not charity. No, said Mrs. Blocksby quietly. It is not. For once, Althea appeared unsettled, only briefly. She gathered the jewellery into neat rows and addressed the room. Tomorrow, perhaps, we shall examine the item properly. I suspect it will make a better story than a better price. Agatha saw Miriam close her eyes. Diana turned away. Percy left without saying good-bye. The evening resumed, but the pleasure had gone out of it. People collected their objects more protectively. Compliments sounded suspicious. Even the shepherdess appeared smug. Charles leaned towards Agatha. Well? Well, what? You've stopped worrying about being laughed at. Agatha looked across the hall at Althea, Miriam, and Diana. I found something more interesting. That sounds dangerous. Only for people with secrets. Outside, rain tapped against the parish hall windows. Inside, Althea Glyde continued smiling, as though she had not merely valued a room full of objects, but priced every person in it. Chapter 3. A box by the back lane. The next morning, rain had polished Carsley's stone walls and turned the lane behind the parish hall into a narrow channel of mud. Agatha arrived later than planned, and found Mrs. Blocksby struggling with a box of donated books beside the back door. "I can manage," said Mrs. Blocksby. "Yes, but then no one will notice how helpful I am." Together they carried the box inside. It was filled with gardening manuals, old cookery books, and several novels whose covers showed women gazing bravely across windswept moors. The hall was colder than the lane. Miriam stood near the kitchen passage, sorting labels into piles. Diana was adjusting the white cloth beneath the better objects, although nothing appeared to have moved overnight. Althea leaned against a trestle table, speaking quietly to Miriam. Agatha set down the box and moved closer under the pretence of examining a lamp. "What was done to your mother was disgraceful," Althea said. Miriam's face tightened. "You know nothing about my mother. I know she was blamed. Keep your voice down. I am offering to correct the record. You are offering to perform it." Althea's smile remained pleasant. "People remember stories better when they are told properly. My mother's life was not a story." Miriam walked away, carrying her labels towards the kitchen. Agatha pretended to test the lamp switch. Althea looked directly at her. "Eavesdropping is most effective when the object you are hiding behind is plugged in." Agatha released the cord. "I wasn't hiding." "Of course not." Diana approached before Agatha could answer. "Althea, may I speak to you?" "You usually do. In private." Althea followed her towards the front of the hall. Mrs. Blocksby joined Agatha. "You heard?" "Enough to know Miriam's mother has something to do with that brooch." Mrs. Blocksby watched Miriam disappear into the kitchen. Charity can become cruel when people begin treating private misfortune as public property. Althea calls that social history. Althea has always been skilled at renaming unpleasant behaviour. A van stopped in the back lane. Percy climbed out and opened its rear doors. "Late donation," he announced. The carton he unloaded was marked "Glass Fragile," though something inside rattled like cutlery. Felix hurried over with his phone. "Wait. I need photographs before we sort it." Percy shifted the box away from him. "People donated it to sell, not to appear in a fashion magazine. You said online listings would increase the total." "I said photographs of decent items might." Felix checked his phone. "Everything should be catalogued." Percy rubbed his thumb along the cardboard. "Not everything needs cataloguing." Agatha saw Althea glance towards them. Percy carried the box inside and placed it beneath the jewellery table. While Felix argued with him about item numbers, Diana crouched near the far side of the trestle table. She reached underneath and pulled out a small packet wrapped in tissue paper. Agatha moved closer. Diana slipped the packet into her handbag. "What have you got there?" Agatha asked. Diana rose too quickly and struck her shoulder against the table. "Nothing." It looked remarkably solid for nothing. "A personal donation I have decided to withdraw. Before anyone values it? I know its value." Diana lowered her voice, making each word sound measured and truthful. "It is a family matter." "So was the brooch?" Diana's face changed. Only slightly, but Agatha saw it. Before she could press further, Althea called from the back lane. "The brooch will make a better story than a better price." She was speaking to someone beyond the doorway. Agatha stepped outside. The lane appeared empty except for rainwater, Percy's van, and a pile of flattened boxes. Althea stood beside the stone wall. "Who were you talking to?" Agatha asked. "No one who wished to be seen. You enjoy this, don't you?" "Enjoy what?" "Watching people squirm." Althea adjusted her scarf. "People rarely squirm unless they are sitting on something uncomfortable, or unless someone keeps poking them." For once, Althea's smile vanished entirely. "You are angry because I embarrassed you. I was angry. And now? Now I'm curious. That may be worse." Reverend Blocksby appeared in the doorway carrying a clipboard. "I fear we are losing sight of the heating fund." Althea smiled again. "On the contrary, Reverend, nothing warms a village like scandal." She returned inside. Reverend Blocksby watched her go. "This sale is beginning to feel less like charity and more like an inspection." Agatha looked at the wet lane, the hidden tissue packet, and the doorway through which Miriam had disappeared. Somewhere inside the hall was a broken brooch that several people recognised and no one wished to discuss, and Althea Glyde intended to make certain they discussed it in public. Chapter 4. The Loft Stairs. By the end of the valuation evening, the parish hall had acquired the exhausted look of a room that had been too interested in other people. Empty coffee cups stood among price cards. Coats had migrated from the cloakroom to chairbacks. Several villagers remained near the better things table, pretending to help while waiting to hear whether Althea would finally explain the brooch. She did not. Instead, she disappeared. At first, no one found this alarming. Althea had spent the evening moving between groups, collecting secrets with the efficiency of Miriam collecting cups. "She's probably telephoning someone," said Diana. "Or writing us all down," said Agatha. Miriam was counting cash beside Reverend Bloxby. Her movements were brisk, but she had counted the same £5 note twice. Felix packed his camera equipment and checked his phone. Her handbag is still here. The dark leather bag rested beneath the valuation table. Mrs. Bloxby looked towards the narrow staircase leading to the loft, where folding chairs, Christmas decorations, and old parish records were stored. "I saw her go that way." Reverend Bloxby frowned. "There is nothing upstairs she needs." Agatha was already crossing the hall. "Althea?" she called. No answer came. The loft stairs were steep and enclosed between two painted walls. A weak bulb burned above the landing. Halfway up, a cardboard carton had tipped against the banister. Then Agatha saw the green silk scarf. It lay across one of the lower steps. She stopped. Althea Glyde was at the foot of the stairs, motionless, one arm bent beneath her. There was no blood and nothing dramatic about the scene. That made it worse. She looked as though she had simply been placed there and forgotten. Mrs. Bloxby reached Agatha and drew in a sharp breath. "Alf," she said quietly, "call the police." The room behind them changed at once. Voices fell. Someone began crying without knowing Althea well enough to justify it. Percy Lobb, who had returned to collect his pocket-knife, backed towards the door. "No one leaves," said Agatha. Percy stared at her. "You're not the police." "No, but Bill Wong will be annoyed if you make him chase you." That proved effective. Miriam lowered herself onto a chair. Diana remained standing, very straight, with one hand gripping her handbag. Bill arrived from Mercester with a uniformed constable and a calmness that made everyone else feel theatrical. He listened to Reverend Bloxby, examined the stairs, and asked the villagers to remain in the hall. "It may have been an accident," he said. "May have been?" Agatha repeated. Bill gave her a warning look. "The stairs are narrow, the lighting is poor. Mrs. Glyde may have fallen. Althea never went anywhere without making certain she had an audience. That is not evidence. It is character. Character becomes evidence only when it proves something." Agatha disliked this distinction, though she knew he was right. Bill examined the landing while the constable photographed the steps. Near the wall lay a crumpled scrap of newspaper. Miriam stood abruptly. "That could have come from any box." Bill turned. "I haven't asked about it." Miriam's face reddened. "No, of course not. We used newspaper for packing all day." "Was it still being used this evening?" "The tables were cleared before the valuation began," said Felix. Miriam looked at him. "Some packing was left in the kitchen." Agatha studied the newspaper scrap. One corner had been folded sharply inward, forming a small triangle. She had seen that fold before. "Where is the brooch?" she asked. No one answered. Bill looked towards the jewellery table. "What brooch?" "The marcasite one. Broken clasp, missing safety chain. Miriam wrapped it in newspaper yesterday." Miriam's hands tightened in her lap. It was put aside because it was unsafe. Agatha crossed to the stack of labels. She lifted them, then searched beneath the table. The packet had gone. Diana spoke from behind her. "Perhaps Althea took it. Her handbag is still here," said Agatha. "She may have put it in a pocket." Bill asked the constable to check Althea's coat and belongings. Nothing was found. The hall seemed to shrink around them. Boxes that had looked comic that morning now formed dark, uneven stacks. Every donated object appeared capable of concealing something. Percy rubbed his thumb over the handle of his pocket-knife. Felix checked his phone. Diana lowered her voice and said, "This is becoming grotesque." Miriam began folding an unused paper napkin into smaller and smaller squares. Bill noticed all of them. "So," he said, "a woman dies near the loft stairs, and an object she had publicly described as interesting disappears. It wasn't valuable," said Miriam. "No," said Agatha, "that was the point." Bill glanced at her. This time he did not tell her she was wrong. Outside, the rain had stopped. Water dripped from the gutters into the dark back lane. Inside, the second chance sale had become a crime scene, and every worthless object seemed to have acquired a price. Chapter 5. The village shop prices everything. By 10 the next morning, Carsley had agreed on 3 things. Althea Glyde had been murdered. Percy Lobb had probably done it, and Agatha Raisin was investigating only because Althea had made her look foolish. All 3 conclusions were being discussed in the village shop beside a display of discounted biscuits. Agatha entered just as Mrs. Cribbage said, "Well, dealers are always up to something." Percy was not present to defend his profession, which made the theory especially attractive. Mr. Pritchard stood by the newspapers with a loaf under one arm. "I saw his van in the back lane after closing." "He said he'd gone home," said Mrs. Cribbage. "He said he had an early start," corrected Agatha. The shop fell quiet. Then everyone greeted her too brightly. "Morning, Agatha. How are you bearing up?" "Terrible business." The sympathy irritated her more than open accusation would have done. "I'm bearing up perfectly well," she said. "I wasn't the one who fell down the stairs." Mrs. Cribbage studied a tin of soup. "No one suggested you were." "No. You merely stopped speaking when I came in." "We were talking about Percy," said Mr. Pritchard. "Of course you were." The shopkeeper placed a carton of milk on the counter and said, "Miriam told someone the brooch was not for the table yet. Wrapped it up herself, apparently." "Who told you that?" Agatha asked. The shopkeeper looked offended. "I couldn't possibly say." "In other words, Mrs. Cribbage." Mrs. Cribbage put down the soup. "I only repeated what I heard. That is the village motto." Mrs. Cribbage ignored this. She was very protective of that brooch. Miriam, I mean. Though Diana was the one who looked terrified when Althea mentioned its history. Agatha picked up a packet of cigarettes she did not need. "What about Percy's van?" Mr. Pritchard leaned closer. "It was definitely there. 9:15. "How definitely?" "I checked my watch. The military one Althea said was 20 years too new?" His face darkened. "That is hardly relevant." It was entirely relevant to his mood, Agatha thought, but perhaps not to the time. A woman near the vegetable rack said, "Percy cheats people. Everyone knows that." "No one knew it yesterday," said Agatha. "We suspected." "That is not the same thing." Still, the idea fitted too neatly to dismiss. Percy undervalued donations. Althea had noticed. He had tried to leave early, returned later, and lied about his movements. Agatha felt the familiar excitement of a pattern forming. It was a relief. Patterns were better than embarrassment. Mrs. Bloxby entered carrying a canvas shopping bag. The conversation softened at once. She greeted everyone, selected tea, and joined Agatha near the counter. "You look pleased," she said. "I may know why Percy returned." Mrs. Blocksby's expression remained mild. "Do you know, or do you want to know?" Agatha frowned. "He had motive and opportunity. So did several others." Percy also lied. In Carsley, that narrows the field very little. Mrs. Cribbage pretended to compare biscuit prices while listening with all her strength. Agatha lowered her voice. "He may have stolen the brooch and killed Althea when she caught him. Perhaps. You don't believe it. I believe Percy may be dishonest. I am not certain dishonesty and murder should be priced together." Agatha disliked the phrase because it was sensible. Outside, the morning was bright after the rain. The wet stone cottages shone, and someone had placed a bucket of late roses beside the shop door with a handwritten sign asking for donations. Agatha lit a cigarette and watched Mrs. Blocksby emerge. "The village thinks I'm doing this because Althea embarrassed me. Are they entirely wrong?" Agatha exhaled sharply. "I'm not that petty." Mrs. Blocksby said nothing. "Well, not only that, petty. That is probably closer." Agatha looked back through the shop window. Inside, Mrs. Cribbage had resumed talking before the door had fully closed. "Percy is hiding something," Agatha said. "I expect he is. And Diana." "Yes, and Miriam." Mrs. Blocksby adjusted her shopping bag. "Then perhaps the most useful question is not who has a secret, but which secret Althea intended to turn into entertainment." Agatha glanced towards the church roof above the cottages. In the shop, the village had already chosen Percy because he looked like the sort of man who stole from old boxes. Agatha found herself wanting the village to be right. That should have warned her. Instead, she decided to find Percy Lobb. Chapter 6. Cats, Clasps, and Hurt Pride. Agatha found Percy's yard outside Evesham filled with furniture no sensible person would have bought while sober. Wardrobes leaned beneath plastic sheets. Dining chairs stood in mismatched rows. A stone cherub watched from beside a broken lawnmower. Percy emerged from a shed, carrying 2 candlesticks. "I suppose you've come to accuse me." "I've come to ask questions. That is how accusing begins." Agatha followed him inside. The shed smelled of dust, damp wood, and old polish. Shelves held clocks, frames, china, and objects whose purposes had been forgotten before Agatha was born. "You returned to the parish hall after saying you had left," she said. "For my pocket-knife. Your van was there at 9:15. I collected a late box from Mrs. Hatcher's cottage. Ask her." "I will." Percy rubbed his thumb across one candlestick. Agatha noticed. "What did Althea know about you?" "That I buy cheap and sell dear. Astonishing discovery for an antiques woman." "She saw you undervalue a silver frame." Percy's cheerfulness disappeared. "I was going to buy it from the sale at the marked price." "After marking it yourself?" He looked away. It was dishonest, but not yet murder. "Did you take the brooch?" Agatha asked. "No." "Did you know its history?" "No." His thumb remained still. Agatha believed that answer, which annoyed her. When she returned to Carsley, the village had already improved the story. Percy was now said to have argued violently with Althea, stolen 3 silver objects, and fled through the back lane. Agatha went home before anyone could tell her she was motivated by wounded vanity. Hodge and Boswell met her in the kitchen with the grave expressions of creditors. "You've been fed," she told them. Hodge disagreed. Agatha made tea, lit a cigarette, and spread the sale notes across the table. Percy had lied about the frame, but probably not about the murder. Diana had taken a packet. Miriam knew the brooch. Felix had a gap in his photographs. Too many secrets crowded the page, without arranging themselves into sense. Boswell jumped onto the dressing table and knocked a cheap costume brooch onto the floor. "Oh, honestly." Agatha bent to retrieve it. Hodge pushed past her, catching a tuft of fur on the bent clasp. He jerked away, pulling a thread from Agatha's sleeve. She stared at the damaged fastening. The marcasite brooch had done the same thing in the donation box. Its broken clasp had caught the cardboard lining. Anyone carrying it loose might snag clothing, paper, or fabric. Agatha sat down slowly. She remembered Miriam wrapping it in newspaper. She remembered the folded corners. She remembered the scrap near the loft stairs. More importantly, she remembered that the brooch had not merely been broken, it had behaved like something broken. If it appeared again without catching, tearing, or snagging, then it might not be the same brooch at all. Agatha opened her notebook and wrote, "Check. Display case." Then, beneath it, "Do not accuse anyone yet." She studied the second line. It seemed unnecessarily restrictive, but Mrs. Blocksby would approve. Outside, evening settled over Carsley. The hedges darkened, and the church bells sounded across the village. Hodge returned to the table and sat on Agatha's notes. Agatha looked at the loose thread hanging from her sleeve. For the first time since Althea's death, her embarrassment had stopped demanding revenge and begun doing something useful. Chapter 7. The Brooch That Behaved Too Well. The parish hall reopened that afternoon for police inventory. The sale tables remained covered, the chairs were stacked against the walls, and yellow tape blocked the loft stairs. Without the villagers, the room looked smaller and rather ashamed of itself. Bill Wong stood beside the jewellery display with a notebook. "You have 10 minutes," he told Agatha. "That is barely enough time to be useful. It may be enough time to avoid becoming obstructive." Agatha ignored this and bent over the glass case. A marcasite brooch lay among paste earrings and costume necklaces. It was oval, dark, and almost identical to the one she had found in the donation box. Diana stood nearby with Miriam and Percy. Felix waited beside his camera bag, checking his phone every few seconds. "There," said Diana. "That must be the brooch everyone has been discussing." Miriam said nothing. Agatha asked Bill to open the case. He sighed, but did so. She lifted the brooch and drew its clasp lightly across the wool of her glove. Nothing caught. She tried again. The fastening moved smoothly over the fabric. "This isn't the same one," she said. Diana's expression remained composed. "It looks exactly the same." "No, it looks nearly the same. The original clasp was broken. It snagged the donation box." Agatha turned it over. The repair mark near the hinge was faint and neat. The original had carried a rough patch of solder. "This is a replacement." Percy leaned closer. "Plenty of those brooches were made." "Which makes finding a similar one easy," said Agatha. Felix checked his phone. Bill noticed. "What are you looking at?" "The photographs. I took shots of the jewellery before the valuation." "Show me." Felix scrolled through the images. There was the box, the beads, and the empty velvet cases. In one photograph, the original brooch was partly visible beneath a bracelet. The next image had been taken 43 minutes later. The brooch was gone. "Why the gap?" Bill asked. "I was photographing the bookstall. There are no book photographs between these two." Felix swallowed. "I may have deleted some." "Why?" "They were blurred." Percy gave a short laugh. "Very convenient." Felix's face reddened. Agatha examined the replacement brooch again. "Who put this in the case?" No one answered. Diana finally said, "I assumed Miriam did." Miriam looked at her. "I assumed Felix had." Felix shook his head. Percy raised both hands. "Don't look at me." Bill closed the case. "Then someone is lying." "That hardly narrows things down," said Agatha. Bill gave her a level look, but Charles would have approved of the line. Miriam began gathering loose labels from the table. Her hands were steady now, too steady. Diana lowered her voice. "This obsession with the brooch is becoming distasteful." "The brooch has already been swapped," said Agatha. "Distasteful has moved on." Diana's eyes hardened. "You are enjoying this because Althea embarrassed you." The words struck cleanly because they repeated what the village had already decided. Agatha felt the old heat rise in her face. "I am enjoying nothing." "Of course." Miriam looked down. Percy smirked. Felix checked his phone again. Agatha wanted to accuse all of them. Instead, she forced herself to place the brooch back in the case. The replacement was too smooth, too intact, and too conveniently visible. Someone wanted the police to believe the missing object had never been missing at all. Bill closed his notebook. "We will trace where this one came from." Agatha looked towards Miriam. A tiny triangle of newspaper protruded from beneath the labels in her hands. Miriam tucked it out of sight. The gesture was quick and ordinary. That made it harder to forget. Chapter 8. Agatha Overprices a Villain. The Red Lion was warm, crowded, and far too pleased with itself. By 7:30, the sale committee had gathered around 2 tables near the fire. Reverend Blocksby drank orange juice. Mrs. Blocksby had tea. Percy Lobb had ordered whiskey, and made certain everyone knew he had paid for it himself. Agatha sat opposite him. Bill Wong had interviewed them all that afternoon, but the village preferred its investigations conducted over drinks. "Someone swapped the brooch," said Felix, checking his phone. "That much is obvious." "Thank you, Sherlock," said Percy. Diana lowered her voice. "There is no reason to assume the swap is connected to Althea's death." "There is every reason," said Agatha. Miriam starred into her tea. Percy leaned back. "Here we go." Agatha had promised herself she would remain calm. Then Percy smiled. It was not a particularly offensive smile, but she had endured enough smiles that week. "You undervalued the silver frame," she said. The table quietened. Percy's face changed. "That again?" "You tried to leave early," returned after closing, "and lied about your van. I collected a donation." "You also knew Althea was watching you." Percy put down his glass. So you took the original brooch, replaced it with a similar one, and killed Althea when she threatened to expose you." Mrs. Blocksby closed her eyes. Reverend Blocksby said, "Agatha." "No," Percy snapped. "Let her finish. She likes an audience too." Several heads at the bar turned towards them. Agatha heard herself continue, although some sensible part of her mind had begun pulling desperately at the brakes. "You deal in house clearances. Finding a matching brooch would be easy. The original may have been worth more than Althea claimed." "It wasn't." "How do you know?" "Because I looked at it." The room stirred. Percy swore under his breath. Agatha leaned forward. "So you admit handling it?" "I looked while it was in the box. Half the room did." "You rubbed your thumb across the frame before lying about its value. You did the same beside the brooch. That is how I handle things. That is how you lie." Percy stood. His chair scraped loudly across the floor. "You're accusing me of murder because that woman laughed at your china shepherdess." A few people looked away. The words struck harder because they contained enough truth to be useful. Agatha rose too. "I'm accusing you because you are dishonest. Dishonest isn't the same as murderous." Mrs. Blocksby had said nearly the same thing. Percy drained his whiskey. "I did mark the silver frame too low. I intended to buy it later. There. Happy?" Reverend Blocksby looked ill. Percy turned to him. "I'll pay the proper price. Double it. But I did not kill Althea, and I did not steal that brooch." He walked out. Silence followed him. Felix stared at his phone. Diana smoothed her sleeve. Miriam folded a paper coaster into quarters. Then a woman from the next table approached Reverend Blocksby. "I'm afraid I shall be taking my mother's tea set home, under the circumstances." Within 10 minutes, 2 more donors withdrew items. Reverend Blocksby watched the heating fund diminish object by object. Agatha sat down. Mrs. Blocksby did not scold her. Her disappointment was worse. Bill entered from the bar and placed a folder on the table. "I heard most of that. You might have arrived sooner," said Agatha. "I wanted to see whether you would stop." He sat opposite her. "Percy's van was in the back lane because he collected a box from Mrs. Hatcher. She confirms it. The constable also found 2 witnesses who saw Percy at her cottage while Althea was still alive." Agatha's stomach tightened. "He still stole from the sale." "Yes. That is why I questioned him. But not for murder. Probably not." Around them, conversation resumed in careful murmurs. The village had found a new story. Agatha Raisin, humiliated by Althea, had attacked an easy villain and damaged the charity sale in the process. Diana's voice softened. "Perhaps we should all avoid making private resentments public." Agatha turned on her. Diana held up one hand. "I meant no offence," which meant she had intended nothing else. Agatha reached for her cigarettes, remembered she was indoors, and put them back. Mrs. Blocksby said quietly, "You can repair this." "How?" "Begin by admitting what you broke." Agatha looked at the empty chair Percy had left behind. She had wanted the shabby dealer to be guilty because he fitted the village's idea of guilt, and because proving him guilty would have made her humiliation seem important rather than petty. The thought was unpleasant. So was Mrs. Blocksby's next question. What if the brooch was never about money at all? Chapter 9. The Family That Did Not Steal. The following morning, Agatha went to the vicarage to apologize. She had hoped Reverend Blocksby might be out. He was not. He opened the door wearing an old cardigan, and the expression of a man who had spent breakfast calculating the cost of heating a parish hall after half the village had reclaimed its donations. "I behaved badly," Agatha said. "Yes. I expected you to make that more difficult. I find agreement saves time." Mrs. Blocksby appeared from the sitting-room. "Come in, Agatha." A fire burned low in the grate. Tea waited beside a plate of shortbread, and several old parish scrapbooks had been arranged on the table. Agatha sat down. "I shall apologize to Percy publicly." "That would be a good beginning," said Mrs. Blocksby. "A good beginning? You also need to understand why you were so certain." "I was following evidence." "You were following evidence that suited your feelings." Agatha took a piece of shortbread. "That sounds unnecessarily personal. Murder usually is." Reverend Blocksby opened the largest scrapbook. Its pages held yellowed newspaper cuttings, church programs, and photographs of village events in which everyone looked either younger or resentful. "After what you said about the brooch," he explained, "I searched the parish records." He turned to a clipping dated more than 40 years earlier. The headline read, "Servant dismissed after jewellery loss." The article was brief. A companion employed by the Vellum family had been accused of taking a marcasite brooch during a house gathering. No police charge had followed, but she had lost her position. The woman's name was Edith Cotterill. "Miriam's mother," said Agatha. Mrs. Blocksby nodded. She raised Miriam alone after that. People did not say thief openly, but they made certain Edith heard it indirectly. Agatha studied the clipping. "The brooch was never recovered?" "Not publicly," said Reverend Blocksby. "But Althea seems to have discovered it remained in the Vellum family. Then Diana's relatives knew Edith was innocent." "Perhaps not at first," said Mrs. Blocksby. but someone knew eventually and chose silence. Agatha thought of Diana slipping the tissue-wrapped packet into her handbag. Althea planned to expose the family. "She planned to expose everyone," said Mrs. Blocksby. "That is not quite the same as seeking justice." A second clipping had been tucked behind the first. It was one of Althea's old society paragraphs, written under a false name. It hinted at a respectable Cotswold family whose missing jewellery had been blamed upon a servant while remaining closer to home. "She knew all those years ago," Agatha said. "Or suspected," said Reverend Blocksby. Mrs. Blocksby poured more tea. Miriam's mother died, believing the village remembered her as a thief. Althea could have corrected that quietly. Instead, she intended to unveil the brooch at the sale, with Diana's family shamed and Miriam's mother discussed like entertainment, said Agatha. Exactly. The room fell silent. Outside, wind stirred the bare branches along the vicarage path. Somewhere in the kitchen, a tap dripped with ecclesiastical patience. Agatha looked again at the clipping. She had assumed the brooch mattered because someone wanted to sell it. But the object had little monetary value. Its power lay in what it proved. Diana feared disgrace. Miriam feared the return of it. Enid Farley, who had once served as companion to Diana's aunt, might know which version of the story was true. "Who donated the brooch?" Agatha asked. "The box arrived without a name," said Reverend Blocksby. "It was left in the back lane. Then someone wanted it found without being seen donating it." Mrs. Blocksby folded her hands. All wanted the truth returned, but lacked the courage to stand beside it. Agatha remembered elderly Enid answering questions about the sale by discussing old weather. She also remembered Miriam wrapping the brooch before anyone had asked her to. What did Miriam say when Althea mentioned her mother? That the story was not Althea's to tell, said Mrs. Blocksby. Agatha stood and walked to the window. Across the lane, Carsley looked harmless. Honey-coloured cottages, trimmed hedges, and a church notice board advertising the second chance sale beneath news of choir practice. Yet the village had helped punish an innocent woman through silence, suspicion, and respectable distance. Agatha turned back. The false accusation damaged Miriam's whole life. Yes, and Althea was going to reopen it publicly. Yes. Reverend Blocksby looked troubled. Understanding a motive is not proving a murder. No, said Agatha. But it tells us why the murderer may not have cared about the brooch's value. Mrs. Blocksby gave her a faint smile. Now you are looking at the right price. Agatha picked up the old clipping. Diana's family had inherited comfort from the lie. Miriam had inherited shame. The brooch had passed between them like a cheap, glittering debt, and Althea Glyde had decided to collect it in public. Chapter 10. Diana's Beautiful Lie. Diana Vellum's drawing-room had been arranged to suggest that no one had ever sat down suddenly. The pale sofas were firm, the cushions remained upright, and every silver object occupied the exact position chosen for it. Even the fire seemed decorative rather than warm. Sir Charles Frayth stood beside a cabinet of miniatures, looking perfectly at ease. Agatha suspected this was because aristocrats were trained from birth to feel comfortable in rooms designed to make everyone else nervous. Diana poured coffee into thin porcelain cups. "I cannot imagine why this required, Charles. Agatha thought I might understand the family codes," he said. "I thought you might stop Diana throwing me out." "That too." Diana lowered her voice. "I have no intention of throwing anyone out." Agatha settled into a chair. "Good. Then tell us what you removed from beneath the sale table." Diana's hand paused over the sugar bowl. "I told you. A private donation, wrapped in tissue paper. Most delicate things are. Was it another brooch?" Diana placed the sugar tongs down with precision. No. Charles picked up a small framed photograph from the mantelpiece. It showed two elderly women standing beside a younger Diana at a summer garden party. "Your aunt?" he asked. Diana looked at the photograph. Aunt Beatrice, and Enid Farley, who was her companion. "Enid donated the box," said Agatha. Diana's expression altered. Only for a second, but enough. "You knew?" Agatha asked. "I suspected." "Why?" "Enid has become sentimental in old age." Agatha gave her a hard look. Sentimental people send Christmas cards. They do not leave evidence of an old injustice in a cardboard box. Diana turned towards the window. Beyond the glass, clipped yew hedges bordered a lawn still wet from rain. "My aunt kept many things," she said. Letters, receipts, jewellery she no longer wore. When she died, Enid helped clear her rooms, and found the brooch. Diana did not answer. Charles returned the photograph to the mantelpiece. "Your family allowed Miriam Cotterell's mother to be accused. My grandfather believed Edith had taken it. But the brooch remained in the house. It was found years later in an evening bag belonging to my grandmother." Agatha felt anger rise. "And no one corrected the story?" "My grandparents were dead by then. Edith had left the district. She had not left the district. She lived 2 villages away." Diana's voice became even quieter. A public admission would have served no practical purpose. It might have served Edith. Diana flinched. Charles watched her closely. "You removed something from the sale because you feared Althea would expose this," he said. Diana sat opposite them. "Yes." At last she opened her handbag and withdrew the tissue-wrapped packet. Inside lay several old letters tied with faded ribbon. Agatha unfolded the first. It was written by Beatrice Vellum to Enid Farley. In it, Beatrice admitted that the brooch had been discovered among her mother's possessions, and that the accusation against Edith Cotterell had almost certainly been false. "You tried to hide these," said Agatha. "I intended to protect my family, and yourself." Diana's eyes hardened. "Would you enjoy having the ugliest act of your family displayed beside chipped teacups and second-hand curtains?" "No," said Agatha, "but I would dislike being murdered even more." "I did not kill Althea." "You argued with her." "So did everyone." "You searched for the brooch." "Yes." "You removed the letters." "Yes." "And you were frightened she would reveal everything publicly." Diana's composure cracked. "Of course I was frightened. Althea did not want justice. She wanted a performance. She would have invited Miriam to stand there while she described her mother's humiliation to a room full of people pretending to be shocked." "That gives you a motive," said Agatha. "It gives Miriam one as well." The words hung in the room. Charles sat on the arm of a chair. "When did you last see Althea alive?" "Near the front doors. She was speaking to Felix." "What time?" "Shortly before 9. "And then?" "I left." "Through the front entrance?" "Yes." Agatha remembered the hall. Miriam had wrapped the brooch early. The original had vanished before the valuation ended. Diana had searched beneath the table, but she had not known where the brooch had been moved. Only someone close to the sorting process had known that. "What did you think was in the newspaper packet?" Agatha asked. Diana frowned. "What packet?" "The one Miriam placed beneath the labels." "I never saw it." Agatha looked at Charles. The theory she had brought into the room began to collapse. Diana had motive. She had concealed letters and lied about the packet in her handbag, but she had not known the original brooch had been wrapped in newspaper and removed from the jewellery box before the valuation. She had searched blindly. The person who replaced the brooch had not. Charles saw the change in Agatha's face. "Not Diana, then?" "Not unless she is lying more cleverly than usual." Diana stood. "I would be grateful if you left." Agatha gathered the letters. "These should go to Bill." Diana reached for them, then stopped. Her anger gave way to something smaller. "My family behaved disgracefully." "Yes. I did not know how to repair it." "So you tried to hide it." Diana looked towards the photograph of her aunt and Enid. "That is what my family has always called repair." Outside, Charles opened the car door for Agatha. "You sound disappointed," he said. "I liked Diana for it." "You accuse people you dislike?" "Whenever possible." As they drove away, Agatha pictured Miriam's neat piles of labels, her newspaper folds, and her quiet insistence that the brooch was not ready for the table. Diana had protected an old lie. But someone else had known exactly where the truth had been wrapped. Chapter 11. Newspaper around broken things. Miriam Cotterill's kitchen was warmer than the parish hall and twice as orderly. Bundles of labels sat beside rolls of string. Folded newspapers filled a wicker basket beneath the table. 3 chipped mugs stood drying beside a sink, polished almost aggressively clean. Miriam opened the door, wearing a grey cardigan. "Agatha, I've come to apologize." Miriam's expression softened too quickly. "For the sale? For Percy? For making matters worse? You were upset. That is not usually considered a legal defense." Miriam stepped aside. Agatha entered carrying a box containing 2 mugs and a brass candlestick. "I thought you might still need donations." "That is kind. It is also an excuse to look around your kitchen." Miriam gave a tired laugh. "At least you are honest." She made tea while Agatha watched her wrap the candlestick in newspaper. The object was solid enough to survive a fall from a church tower, yet Miriam folded the paper around it carefully. First the lower edge, then the sides, then each corner tucked into a sharp triangle. Agatha looked at the folds. They matched the scrap found near the loft stairs. "You wrap everything like that," she said. "My mother taught me. She worked in service. Things had to arrive without damage." The mention of her mother altered the room. Agatha set down her tea. "We found the old clipping." Miriam continued folding. "I thought you might. And the letters Diana removed from the sale." This time Miriam stopped, so she finally admitted it. "Her family knew your mother had been falsely accused." "My mother knew they knew." Agatha felt a small shock. "She knew?" "Not at first. Years later, someone sent her an unsigned note. It said the brooch had been found in the house, and she never confronted them." "She did." Miriam's voice remained calm, but her hands crushed the newspaper around the candlestick. "They told her there was no proof. They said raising the matter would only revive unpleasant gossip." She came home and burned the note. Agatha pictured Edith Cotterill being asked to preserve the dignity of the people who had ruined hers. "Enid donated the brooch," she said. Miriam nodded. "She found it among Beatrice Vellum's things. She wanted the truth known before she died. But Althea found out. She always found out." Miriam placed the wrapped candlestick beside the mugs. "She came to me after the first sorting session. She said she would reveal everything during the sale. She wanted me beside her when she did it. To make the moment more powerful, to make it more entertaining." Miriam turned towards the sink. "I asked her to give the brooch to Reverend Blocksby with a written account, quietly." She laughed. Agatha glanced at the grey cardigan. Near the lower pocket, one strand of wool had been pulled loose. "The original brooch caught on things," she said. Miriam looked down. "You wrapped it because you knew the clasp was broken." "I wrapped it because it belonged to my mother's story." "You hid it beneath the labels." "Yes, and later replaced it with another." Miriam's face emptied. Agatha continued before courage failed her. You had access to the jewellery, the packing paper and the loft. You knew Althea was going upstairs because you told her the parish scrapbook was stored there. That is not true. The scrapbook was already in the vicarage. You knew that. Miriam folded her arms. Agatha picked up the wrapped candlestick and examined the paper. The scrap near the stairs carried your triangular fold. Not proof by itself, but the original brooch would have snagged when you carried it. She pointed to the loose fibre on Miriam's cardigan. Miriam's gaze dropped again. For the first time she looked frightened. I did not mean for her to fall. Agatha said nothing. Miriam gripped the edge of the sink. She followed me upstairs. I had taken the brooch from the packet because I wanted to hide it in the old decorations until the sale was over. Althea saw it in my hand. She threatened to expose you? She said, hiding it proved I was ashamed of my mother. Miriam's voice sharpened. I was not ashamed of her. I was ashamed of the way everyone had looked at her, the way they still spoke kindly while making certain she knew she was not welcome. The kitchen clock ticked above them. She tried to take the brooch, Miriam said. It caught in my cardigan. We struggled. I pushed her hand away, and she fell. Miriam closed her eyes. Afterwards, I moved the box near the stairs. I thought people would believe she had tripped. You planted the replacement. I had one from my mother's things. She had bought it years later because she said no cheap brooch should frighten her. The sadness of that silenced Agatha. You could have told Bill, she said at last, and let Althea win. Let the whole village discuss Mother again. They will discuss her now. Yes. Miriam looked around the immaculate kitchen. But perhaps this time they will say she was innocent. Agatha heard a car stop outside. Bill Wong had arrived. Miriam did not move towards the door. Agatha looked at the newspapers, each folded neatly around objects that did not need protection. Miriam had spent her life wrapping sturdy things as though the world were waiting to break them. This time, the wrapping had preserved the truth instead. Chapter 12. The sale must go on. The second chance sale reopened on Saturday beneath a handwritten notice that read, All donations final unless previously withdrawn. Agatha suspected the last two words had been added for legal, emotional, and Diana-related reasons. The parish hall was crowded again, though the atmosphere had changed. Villagers handled objects cautiously, as if a chipped plate might contain evidence against their grandparents. Miriam had not returned. Bill had taken her to Mercester after her statement. By lunchtime, Carsley had produced 6 different accounts of the arrest, including one involving handcuffs, a police van, and a dramatic confession beneath the church tower. None was true. Reverend Blocksby stood beside the entrance, welcoming visitors with determined warmth. Mrs. Blocksby managed the refreshment table. Felix had resumed photographing items, though Bill had temporarily confiscated his phone after discovering that he had privately listed a donated clock. Percy stood behind the miscellaneous table, with his arms folded. When Agatha entered, conversation faltered. She had expected it. She walked directly towards Percy. I owe you an apology. Percy glanced around to make certain there was an audience. Yes, you do. I accused you of murder without sufficient evidence. Without any evidence. You had some very suspicious habits. I'm a dealer. That is what I said. Mrs. Blocksby gave Agatha a look. Agatha took a breath. I was wrong. I embarrassed you publicly, so I am apologizing publicly. Percy considered this. And the silver frame? You still tried to cheat the sale. I've paid £60 for it. It is worth 80. Percy's mouth twitched. 70. Done. They shook hands. The room relaxed slightly. Carsley approved of reconciliation when it included bargaining. Bill arrived shortly afterwards, carrying a small evidence bag. Inside lay the original marcasite brooch. Diana Vellum, Enid Farley, and several committee members had gathered near the jewellery table. Enid sat beside Mrs. Bloxby, small and pale, beneath a lavender hat. "I understand you wish to explain," Bill said to Agatha. "Only what can now be explained." He gave her a warning look. No theatrics. "Of course not." Charles, standing behind him, smiled. Agatha faced the room. The brooch found in the display case was not the one donated. Felix shifted uneasily. "The original had a damaged clasp," Agatha continued. "It caught on the cardboard box when I first lifted it. Miriam wrapped it in newspaper because she already understood what it was." Diana looked towards Enid. "You placed it in the donation box," said Agatha. Enid nodded. "I wanted someone to find it." "You also included the letters." "Yes." Her voice trembled. "I should have spoken years ago." Diana lowered her eyes. Agatha turned back to the evidence bag. After Althea recognized the brooch, Miriam removed it from the table. She knew Althea intended to reveal the old accusation against Miriam's mother before the entire village. Mrs. Cribbage whispered something to Mr. Pritchard. Agatha looked directly at her. "This is precisely the behaviour Miriam feared." Mrs. Cribbage became interested in a bowl of buttons. "Althea told Miriam that the parish scrapbook was stored in the loft," Agatha continued. "Miriam used that excuse to lead her towards the stairs. She intended to hide the brooch among the stored decorations." Bill's expression reminded her that Miriam's full account had not yet been released. Agatha stayed with what could be proved. The brooch snagged Miriam's cardigan. Althea tried to take it. During the struggle, Althea fell. The hall was silent. Miriam then staged the scene as an accident. She moved a box near the stairs and later placed a similar brooch in the display case. Bill raised the evidence bag. The replacement had an undamaged clasp. The original did not. "And the newspaper?" asked Reverend Bloxby. Agatha picked up a sheet from the packing table. Miriam folded paper in a particular way. Lower edge first, sides inward, then the corners tucked into triangles. A scrap folded in exactly that pattern was found near the stairs. "Many people fold paper," said Diana. "Yes, but not everyone wrapped the original brooch, knew where it had been hidden, and wore a cardigan with a pulled fibre matching one caught in its clasp." Bill placed the bag upon the table. Inside, a grey thread clung to the damaged fastening. A fragment of newspaper remained trapped near the old repair. The brooch glittered beneath the hall lights. It looked cheap, broken, and entirely unequal to the lives it had damaged. Diana spoke quietly. "My family should have cleared Edith Cotterill's name." "Yes," said Agatha. "They should." Enid began to cry. Mrs. Bloxby took her hand. "But Miriam killed Althea," Reverend Bloxby said sadly. "She did," said Agatha. "Understanding why does not undo what she did. No one offered an easy defence." That, Agatha thought, was a kind of mercy too. Reverend Bloxby removed the brooch from the sale inventory. At Agatha's suggestion, it would eventually be placed in the parish records beside a written account naming Edith Cotterill as falsely accused. The sale resumed. Percy sold the silver frame for £90 and donated the difference with bad grace. Felix removed 3 private listings. Diana purchased a box of chipped cups she did not need. Near closing time, Agatha found her porcelain shepherdess still sitting on the better things table. A price label had been attached to its base. 50p. She bought it herself. Charles watched her place the coin in the cash tin. Sentimental? Certainly not. Then why rescue it? Agatha tucked the shepherdess beneath her arm. "Because I refuse to let Diana buy it for the garden shed." Outside, evening settled over Carsley's stone roofs and dark hedges. Behind her, the parish hall remained warm with voices, embarrassment, and imperfect good intentions. The sale had not raised as much money as Reverend Blocksby had hoped, but at least one discarded thing had finally been given its proper name. Chapter 13. Second Chances. Miriam Cotterill was taken away quietly. That disappointed Carsley, which preferred important events to happen where curtains could be moved aside without appearing curious. By Monday morning, the village shop had established that Miriam had acted alone, had not acted alone, had confessed immediately, and had refused to say a word. Agatha heard all 4 versions while buying milk. Mrs. Cribbage stood beside the bread-rack. "It is terribly sad." "Yes," said Agatha, "though, of course, there is no excuse." "No, one can understand it. One can understand many things without approving of them." Mrs. Cribbage looked faintly disappointed by this lack of scandalous certainty. At the vicarage, Reverend Blocksby prepared a written account of Edith Cotterill's false accusation for the parish records. Enid Farley contributed a signed statement, though writing it exhausted her. Diana supplied the old letters, and made no attempt to recover them. Her reputation did not collapse. Carsley reputations rarely collapsed cleanly. They developed cracks, acquired careful repairs, and remained on display. People began referring to Diana's family as complicated, which was the village term for disgrace among those with good furniture. The second chance sale raised less money than expected, but enough to repair the parish hall boiler before the first frost. Percy Lobb donated £10 more than necessary and told everyone it had been 5. Felix returned the money from his private listings and was placed in charge of carrying tables, a role with fewer opportunities for enterprise. Agatha visited Mrs. Blocksby on the vicarage path. Autumn leaves had collected along the churchyard wall. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. "You did well in the hall," Mrs. Blocksby said. "I accused the wrong man first. You corrected yourself. Eventually. That is how most people improve." Agatha looked towards the parish hall. "Do you think Miriam meant to kill her?" "I think she meant to stop her." "That is not the same thing." "No. But people often discover the difference too late." They walked in silence for a few steps. "I hated Althea," Agatha admitted, "for making me look ridiculous." Mrs. Blocksby smiled gently. "You disliked her before she died. That is permitted. I wanted the murder to prove my humiliation mattered. And did it?" Agatha considered. "No. It proved Althea had humiliated people far more cruelly. That may be why you eventually saw the case clearly. It was an irritatingly kind interpretation. At home, Agatha placed the porcelain shepherdess on the sitting-room table. Hodge jumped up beside it. "Leave that alone." Hodge pushed the ornament with one paw. It wobbled. Agatha moved it further from the edge. Boswell appeared and examined the shepherdess with professional interest. "I paid 50p for that." Neither cat appeared impressed. The telephone rang. It was Charles. "Drinks?" he asked. "Are you celebrating my success?" "I was considering celebrating your public apology. It may never happen again." "I can apologize." "Yes. You simply prefer doing it after several witnesses have suffered." Agatha smiled despite herself. "Tomorrow. 7? 7:30. Trying to appear unavailable?" "I am unavailable." "Until 7:30. After the call, Agatha lit a cigarette and opened the window slightly. Across Carsley, evening settled over honey-coloured walls and darkening gardens. A car passed along the lane. The church bell marked the hour. Somewhere, Mrs. Cribbage was almost certainly correcting the latest version of the story with another equally inaccurate one. Hodge nudged the shepherdess again. This time it fell onto the carpet. Agatha picked it up. The ornament had survived without a chip. "Reproductions," she told the cat, "have their advantages." The broken brooch would not return to a sale table. Once the police released it, Reverend Blocksby would place it in the parish archive beside Edith Cotterell's name and the truth that had arrived decades too late. It had little value. It had caused enormous damage. And now, at last, it would no longer belong to the people who had hidden it. Agatha returned the shepherdess to the table, this time well away from Hodge. Carsley had regained its routines, but not all its illusions. For a village, that was probably as close to a second chance as anyone could expect. Moral reflection. This is Clara Whitfield. Carsley's sale did not raise quite as much money as Reverend Blocksby had hoped. Several villagers took their treasures home after learning that value could be a dangerous subject. Even so, the parish hall was warm that winter, and one old story was finally recorded honestly. The broken brooch had looked like cheap jewellery in a cardboard box. Yet its damaged clasp caught at paper, wool, and memory until the truth could no longer slip away. We often imagine that discarded things have lost their power. Sometimes they are simply waiting for someone honest enough or awkward enough to pick them up again. At home, Agatha watched Hodge knock her shepherdess onto the carpet for the third time and decided that reproduction antiques had their uses after all. Would you have followed the money first, or would the broken clasp have made you look more closely? Closing outro. Thank you for listening to Cotswold Cozy Mysteries. Do share your theory and the clue that first made you suspicious in the comments. The last bargains may have been wrapped in newspaper, but Carsley will not remain peaceful for long. Another village misadventure is already waiting behind a very respectable front door.